After studying this module, you will be able to know about ethics in forensic anthropology, need for ethical norms, areas of ethical guidance, and forensic complexities. This understanding of concept of morals in human conduct to describe the standards of conduct and moral judgment is called ethics. These are the values that are implied in all aspects of our lives. Human cultures have various ethics based on their legal structure as well as religious beliefs. A forensic anthropologist have to work according to the ethical norms of the human culture. Protocols have been formed for a forensic anthropologist for the implementation of ethical norms in their behavior and professional conduct. The presence of human bones or the human remains has led to the highlighting of these ethical dimensions. Now, what is the necessity of these ethical codes in the context of ethical codes? Forensic science is concerned with a different type of archaeological context. The main question which arises is that whether forensic anthropologists need to establish a specific code of conduct which addresses the complexity and sensitivity of the work they are likely to be undertaking with regard to contemporary human remains in a medico-legal environment. Forensic anthropologists or forensic archaeologists, they contribute to the matters of justice and human rights issues. These people are associated with crime against humanity like war crimes, domestic murder, etc. They do not come in contact only with the recently dead bodies, but also with those bodies whose rites and rituals have been performed much earlier. In such cases, their religious and cultural norms need be considered. The victims themselves should be recovered in a manner which may need to balance practical difficulties, evidentiary requirements, and the dignity of the individual, both dead and survivor. Most will have lost their lives unlawfully, in many cases in a manner that is abhorrent, often following periods of incarceration and torture. In political killings, particularly in mass graves, injustice may be exacerbated by denial of basic human rights or torture. During the process of recovery and analysis, such evidences must be recognized by archaeologists and anthropologists. All these factors make it more important to develop a code of conduct and ethical standards. These ethical values or codes do not only apply to field practice, laboratory work, expert testimony, etc., but also in interaction with the media or publication, etc. The first step to contextualize these ethical and legal steps has been made by Thompson in 2001, which demonstrates the complexity of various such situations and importance of considering ethical values. Many teaching hospitals and organizations which deal with the human subjects for research have drawn up their own ethical guidelines and regulations. Earlier, in forensic anthropology, unethical collection and retention of body parts was practiced for research purposes. Anthropologists working through the British Association for Human Identification, if I talk about the situation of United Kingdom, they are now setting codes of the conduct and ethics, and archaeologists are also following a similar route. All these created standards should be extended from practice field and laboratory to the research and education in forensic anthropology and archaeology. This may entail little more than making practical adjustments in order to achieve ethical and moral resolutions through a balancing of experience and reason. Professionals do not have an impressive track record in these areas, not at least because of the cultural practice of some individuals in the long-term collection and retention of human remains, both archaeological and modern. Forensic anthropologists and archaeologists should have sufficient experience to analyze the importance and application of moral reasoning and ethics. Ethics should be defined with relevance to working in multinational groups in various cultural and geographical regions and for the investigation of crime against humanity. Ability to operate within ethical limits is an important trait for an effective and professional community. Specific standards for the good practice in research is listed in the Declaration of Helsinki, which includes guiding principles and concepts as that is the beneficence, that is to do positive good only, non-maleficence, that is to do no harm. The third one is the informed consent. Fourth is the maintenance of the confidentiality or anonymity. And last but not the least is the veracity, or to tell the truth only. All this should apply to professional practice and research in forensic anthropology and archaeology, and many are protected within legal and regulatory codes. There is also an argument to suggest that this should be extended into research in forensic sciences that provide the necessary framework for examining the ends and achieving the goals. Now let's see the areas of ethical guidance. They can be divided into several broad areas. Let's see the code of conduct first. That is to uphold respect for human life at all times, to act with integrity and honesty in all circumstances, to provide confidential, informed and impartial advice, to practice within relevant current legal and regulatory frameworks, to respect the culture and religious values of the host country when working overseas, to uphold rules of confidentiality and where appropriate of matters which are sub judice, to promote the improvement of standards and services through professional bodies, education, research and best practice, particularly in overseas environments, and to keep up to date with developments in the field and laboratory techniques, to refrain from issuing statements which appear to represent the position of the profession as a whole without the specific authority to do so, and to prevent and outlaw the malpractice. Now let's see the contractual and operational involvement. To provide services to the highest standards of excellence within the practitioner's field of competence, to uphold the terms of service agreed at the outset of any contract, to work within defined resource constraints like time, personal, financial, to set reasonable fees consistent with those charged by other forensic scientists, to refrain from undertaking work on a contingency fee basis, to refrain from taking instructions from any party that are legally or morally unacceptable or which preclude good scientific practice, to recognize and advise on techniques from an informed basis only, to maintain the highest level of objectivity in all cases and to accurately present the facts involved based on the limitations of the evidence itself, to accept the need to adapt methodology when warranted by particular circumstances, to ensure appropriate reporting and archiving of findings and data, and to refrain from working with non-police or other formal investigative agencies or to jeopardize ongoing police inquiries. Now let's see the third aspect, that is the human materials in the field and in research. The duties, the ethics involved in that. To accord human remains the utmost decency, dignity and respect under all circumstances, to accord survivors and relatives the utmost respect and have due regard to their emotional, religious and cultural needs, to refrain from reviewing samples from human remains for forensic or research purposes without appropriate permission from relatives or next of kin, to refrain from removing samples from human remains for forensic or research purposes unless commensurate with legal, religious and cultural dictates, to ensure wherever possible that all human material taken for sampling or removed in the process of sampling is ultimately interred with the remains, to avoid undertaking research using material or data derived from unethical contexts, to undertake research based upon sound scientific principles, to disseminate wherever possible the results of research and fieldwork which may increase knowledge or provide beneficial information for the future work, to respect the fieldwork, research and intellectual property of others, and to refrain from undertaking research using animal remains outside of current legislation and regulation and without due regard to the environment and public health. When acting as an expert witness, ethics involved in that. to offer opinions only on matters within one's own area of specialization and competence, and not to venture upon the other's area, not to encroach upon the other's area. To explicitly state the limitations of the evidence itself, to explicitly state the limitations of the methodology employed, to make every effort to use language and terminology that can be understood by the court, to clearly differentiate between scientific results and expert opinion, to disclose all findings irrespective of their implications, to advise on the work of another expert in good faith, objectively and not maliciously. Then ethics involved in the education and public liaison. Only to use human remains in teaching if their provenance is acceptable both legally and ethically. To avoid using human remains in education in any way that might detract from the value of human life and dignity. Only to use illustrative material of human remains when necessary in publication or lecture, irrespective of the level of the intended readership or audience. To make efforts to ensure that illustrative material will not be offensive from any legal, political, cultural or religious point of view. Only to use shocking, explicit or gruesome illustrations where it is beneficial and only to the professional audiences. To make every effort to include tuition on ethics in forensic practice in programs at all levels of education. Now let's see the forensic complexities involved in these. The level of complexity arises when forensic parameter is introduced in the analysis of human remains. There are many differences between using human remains for research and for forensic purpose. Recovery, handling and sampling of human remains have different and immediate reasons in case of forensics as compared to research. Identification and investigation of human remains or forensic evidence, this introduces potential conflict with ethical mores. Recovery of forensic evidence is a matter of balance and of weighing up respective values. The value of other evidences might be negated because of collection of some other type of evidences. Experience in this field helps in evaluating the problems in any given situation. It is not as straightforward as it sounds. Greater experience regarding recovery, collection and evaluation of human bones leads to greater realization of the complexity of issues that arise. Consider, for example, whether or not it is more important to achieve correct and efficient identification and a successful conviction, or to preserve the rights of the individual and perhaps achieve neither. An important question arises whether the anthropologist or archaeologist or the investigator have the right to make that decision. And what does the archaeologist do if he or she feels unable to accept an imposed judgment? The recovery of forensic evidences is rarely straightforward, as there are many factors which affect the recovery of evidences difficult, such as putrefying, saponification or maggot infested bodies when they are highly decomposed. To understand the deposition sequence in mass graves, sometimes disarticulation of bodies is also required. To make necessary measurements, separation of fleshed body parts is required. DNA analysis requires sampling and the rigors of the autopsy process itself to establish cause as well as manner of death may also require intrusive practice for these specific purposes. It is comparatively easy to set some codes for such practices, but it is not always possible to adhere to these in actual practice. Higher level of complexity arises when the archaeologist or anthropologist is required to work overseas in an environment where they are not in charge of the operations but are only needed for the assistant or observation of the operation. In such funding is less and there is lack of experienced professionals. Such situations create a difficult situation for archaeologists to understand whose standards to apply from the country where they belong, where they have learned, or where they are working on the temporary basis. According to a report, a work was undertaken by local exhumation groups without recourse to formal or the Western standards, perhaps without a secure chain of custody or adherence to the ethical codes, and with ignorance of stratigraphic importance, grave ages, or depositional events. There was an absence of systematic sampling strategies. Human remains in such case might have been left exposed seemingly unnecessarily for any number of reasons, some more valid and excusable than others. Bodies may be walked upon because no other access is possible with the facilities available. The stacking of unlabeled dislocated body parts in bags may be seen as a perfectly proper, and isolated bones trodden into the ground may be ignored. Ultimately, the mission mandate provided some guidance as to what was expected. Some other challenging areas are situations in which local people are employed as laborers to excavate the grave under the investigation. To think positive, they might be on the part of the survivor community, but the negative aspect will be the collaborators in the criminal procedure under investigation. Other challenging areas are, for example, where local people might be employed as laborer to excavate graves for the investigating team. At best, they may be part of the survivor community and will have lost family members. At worst, they will be collaborator in the criminal processes under investigation. In either case, they are unlikely to be impartial witness to fact, essential criteria in providing evidence for serious crimes such as genocide by Western standards. Either way, they will be inexperienced forensic practitioners with no significant contribution to the practicalities of a forensic investigation, but the potential to destroy evidence. In some contexts, local communities may exhume their dead bodies unaided by experts, their main concern being to obtain the return of their loved ones. There should also be the transparent audits of field and laboratory procedures, that is a technical and scientific audit that will also have judicial value in terms of transparency of the process. Now, to summarize the topic, this understanding of the concept of morals and ethics in human conduct to describe the standards of conduct and moral judgment is called as ethics. A forensic archaeologist or the anthropologist has to work according to the ethical norms of the human culture. The main question which arises is that whether a forensic anthropologist need to establish a specific code of conduct which addresses the complexity and sensitivity of the work they are likely to be undertaking with regard to contemporary human remains in a medico-legal environment. The first step to contextualize these ethical and legal steps have been made in 2001, which demonstrate the complexity of various such situations and importance of considering ethical values. Bahid, that is the anthropologists working through the British Association for Human Identification, they are now setting codes of conduct for ethics, and similarly they are being followed by the archaeologists as well. The specific standards for the good practice in research is listed in the Declaration of Helsinki, which includes guiding principles and concepts such as beneficence, non-maleficence, informed consent, confidentiality or anonymity, and veracity. Ethical guidelines can be divided into several broad areas, that is the code of conduct, contractual and operational involvement, human materials in the field and in research, acting as an expert witness, education and public liaison. Recovery, handling and sampling of human remains have different and immediate reasons in case of forensics as compared to research. Recovery of forensic evidence is a matter of balance and of weighing up respective values. Greater experience regarding recovery, collection and evaluation of human bones led to greater realization of the complexity of issues that arise. There are many factors which affect the recovery of evidences such as putrefaction, saponification or maggot-infested bodies. The DNA analysis requires sampling, and the rigors of the autopsy process itself to establish cause and manner of death may also require intrusive practice for specific purposes. There should also be the transparent audits of the field and laboratory procedures, that is a technical and scientific audit that will also have judicial values in terms of transparency of process.